It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Claire Coutinho, Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran, Stephen Bush from the Financial Times and Julia Hartley-Brewer from Talk Radio. Remember this?
There was no party and that no COVID rules were broken, and that is what I have been repeatedly assured.
Now the Met Police will issue fines for lockdown parties in Downing Street. What will that mean for the Prime Minister's leadership?
The considerable action that we've put in place is offsetting about a third of the drop in living standards.
After last week's mini-budget, does Rishi Sunak understand the scale of the cost of living squeeze?
Stop Brexit!
The EU referendum was 6 years ago. Now the Liberal Democrats have a new policy.
We would aim to place the UK-EU relationship on a more formal footing, a more stable one, by seeking to join the single market.
We'll ask their Foreign Affairs spokesperson why. As Nicola Sturgeon decides whether to keep face mask rules in Scotland, is now the time to move on from COVID. Let's start with Partygate. You heard there in the headlines. This story, BBC News, 20 fines to be issued initially over number 10 lockdown parties. Well, that's the news that Scotland Yard have confirmed that 20 fixed penalty notices will be issued over illegal parties at Downing Street while the rest of the country was either in lockdown or under some form of COVID restrictions. Now, of course, it dominated the news agenda at the beginning of the year, right up until the war in Ukraine. So my question to all of you is, how important is the issue of Partygate? Claire?
Well, look, I don't think it's great what happened. I think we can all admit mistakes were made, and it's important not to gloss over those. I completely understand why people are really, really upset. But as you point out, it's not dominating the news agenda at the moment, and I think that's because the Prime Minister has taken steps to rebuild confidence. So we've seen him apologise. He's changed several members of his senior team to boost their operation around him. And also, I think he's shown really strong leadership on the world stage when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. And those are all things which matter to me when it comes to thinking about having confidence and trust in that operation in Downing Street.
How important is this issue of Partygate, Layla?
I think it didn't really go away. The thing that he did was not rebuild confidence. There was a war, and that took everything off the front pages. But the fact this has been festering in the background, and fundamentally, if we have a Prime Minister who's going to be issued with a fine, he needs to resign. He absolutely needs to resign, because trust and confidence is absolutely right. We have an extraordinarily difficult situation, not just with the war, but also the cost of living crisis. This has happened before, by the way. So when people say, how can we remove a Prime Minister during a time of international crisis? Well, this is exactly what happened to Margaret Thatcher. It was the Gulf War in 1990. And actually, I will say, Parliament is pulling together around this. There are very capable ministers, Ben Wallace being one, for example. I think the best thing that for the Conservative Party to do, if he's issued with a fine, is then to put in their 54 letters and remove him, because he is a liability now for the country.
Claire?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals, as you would expect, but I would also point to the praise that Boris Johnson has got from President Zelensky, who singled him out as a world leader for all the things that he's done to support Ukraine. So I think that he's an important part of all of that response as well.
But that's not going to stop if he goes. And the fact is, Parliament is absolutely pulling in the same direction, so that's not the problem. Fundamentally, if he's issued with a fine, you have a lawbreaker at the head of our government. That is wrong. He's taken it too far. He lied to Parliament, as your clip earlier showed.
Well, it posed the question.
It posed the question. Well, I have to say, it now looks very likely that he more than bent the truth. I think people can see him for what he is. And I think if the Conservatives are clever, they'll remove him now.
How important is this story?
Well, I think essentially the reason why it's so important is that the government asked people to do something, was very difficult, involved a lot of personal sacrifices, and then didn't follow the rules, and it kept, right? And regardless of whether or not that is something which leads to the Prime Minister being fined or simply speaks to the culture of the institution he heads, that is obviously a very big issue for most voters.
I just think it's quite wrong to say it was a mistake. They didn't make mistakes. They didn't accidentally stumble into bring your own booze parties or get wheelie bags up Whitehall from the local off licence. Prime Minister, undoubtedly, 100%, he lied to Parliament repeatedly about this. And it used to be the case that our politicians, if they lied to Parliament, had to resign. I think a lot of people are making the point when Ukraine, we've moved on and things like that. Well, I mean, we did actually change Prime Minister during the Second World War. So that's not necessarily the issue. I know a lot of the heat has gone out of this for a lot of people and certainly for a lot of backbench MPs. I still think there is a fundamental principle at stake, and it's not sort of, oh, people were losing their loved ones and couldn't go to funerals. As awful and terrible and sad as that is, it's that the government, all those people in number 10 are at those parties, they imposed rules on millions of us, which they, not that they didn't obey, they knew were not necessary. And they didn't think they were necessary. They didn't go to those parties thinking, oh, goodness me, I might die if I go to a party. They knew they were not needed for people of their age. And they imposed those rules on ourselves. Now, that is a level of arrogance and, frankly, obscenity by making millions of other people obey rules they knew weren't necessary that I find untenable. And I'm sorry, I really think that it's untenable for the Prime Minister, if he gets a fine, to remain in office.
Claire?
Well, look, the thing I'll say about lockdowns is, for me, they was most uncomfortable votes I had in Parliament. You know, I really worried about them and putting restrictions on people's lives. So I do have complete sympathy for Julia's view. But I do think they were doing that for the best interest for the country. The evidence they had was that we needed to manage the virus.
Why did they think they had to obey the rules then? Why did they think they were safe?
Well, hang on, let Claire respond.
Well, I think, you know, firstly, I think we should see what's actually happening in the report before I can comment on exactly what's happened in Downing Street. But I think what I saw from the inside, being a member of Parliament, was people who were working very hard in the interests of the country to try and protect people.
Right, well, let's go and talk to Ian Watson, political correspondent at the BBC. He's in Central Lobby. Just remind us how we got here, Ian.
Yes, we got here, Jo, through two things, really. First of all, the Daily Mirror last December suggesting there had been, the previous December, a Christmas party when London was in very serious COVID restrictions. At that time, the Prime Minister had said that no COVID rules were broken, and he doubled down on that a week later when he also insisted that guidelines had been followed and had continued to be followed. But when a video of his then spokeswoman Allegra Stratton appeared to be making fun of this very event, not only did she resign, but he then decided there had to be an inquiry under the then under the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case. He was then carrying out the inquiry, but had to step aside over allegations that there had been an event in his own office. So the senior civil servant Sue Gray took over. She investigated what turned out to be 16 different allegations of events or gatherings or parties, and the Metropolitan Police decided to investigate 12 of them, 3 of which the Prime Minister was present at. He himself admitted he spent 25 minutes in the Downing Street garden at an event where his private secretary had invited people to bring their own booze. Now, what we have had today, though, for the first time, and this is why I think today is very significant, is that despite repeated denials that parties took place or that COVID rules had been broken, the Metropolitan Police beg to differ. They say they have enough evidence that the rules that the government imposed were broken at the heart of government during lockdown.
What about the people who may actually receive these fines, fixed penalty notices? We're saying there are about 20 of them. It might not be as many people, of course, as fines.
That's right, because there are 12 events. It's possible that a small number of people have been fined several times for attending several events. We don't know yet, and the police won't tell us, or in fact are determined not to name those who get these fixed penalty notices. And if they keep quiet and just pay up when these arrive through their letterbox, perhaps in a few days' time, it may be difficult to identify them precisely. However, that is not to say that people who are involved in rule breaking will not be exposed, because Sue Gray, the senior civil servant looking into this, simply gave us an update of what she was doing while the police were carrying out their investigations. Her full report is yet to be published, and it is likely, I'm told, to name certain individuals and the role they played in some of these events. So that carries some jeopardy for them and indeed for the Prime Minister. But as we've been hearing, the question is whether the Prime Minister is amongst this 20. If he is, if he himself is found to have broken his own rules, if he's issued with a fixed penalty notice, then calls for him to go will again increase. And it's certainly the case that some of his own MPs believe that simply in the statements he's made to Parliament, he's been misleading Parliament, that should be a resigning matter. But they're still very much a minority, and some of those who are sceptical towards the Prime Minister, still saying they want to wait for that full Sue Gray report to be published before they form a judgment on whether he ought to stay or whether he ought to go. But given that a couple of MPs who had submitted letters of no confidence have withdrawn them because of the Ukraine conflict, I think he still has a bit of breathing space, despite the fact that we have this development proving that it was rule-breaking at the heart of government.
Ian Watson there in Central Lobby, thank you very much. We've also got this from Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, who has been asked about breaches of lockdown. It's important, he says, that justice is done without fear or favour in cases of this nature, and we all want to see people held to account if they've done wrong. That would include the Prime Minister, wouldn't it, Claire?
Well, I mean, we've seen consequences being taken for people. You know, several people have left Downing Street, and I think that's quite right. And I do think it's really important that the Prime Minister's apologise, but to see what happens next, I would like to see what is actually in the report. I
mean, in terms of the damage done to the Prime Minister thus far, it will still take 54 Conservative MPs to actually trigger a vote of no confidence in the end. How much trouble do you think he still is in, Boris Johnson?
Well, I think in terms of getting to that first hurdle of 54 letters, probably quite a lot of trouble, but that only triggers the first stage, which is having a contest. And it's very easy to write a letter saying, I don't like my current boss. It's quite another when you look at the alternatives to go, actually, I feel a great enthusiasm for any of the others. And that is where the Prime Minister, I think, is currently not in all that much danger, because there isn't yet a great deal of buzz around any of the potential replacements.
I mean, can the Prime Minister just move on, Claire, from this, in the way you were sort of implying?
Well, look, I think, like I said, you know, we shouldn't gloss over it. I'd like to see it addressed. But he has taken steps already, and I think what I want to see is what's actually in the report, and I'm sure there'll be a response from Downing Street to that.
I mean, is now the time to call for the Prime Minister to resign? I know Julia said that, of course, you can do these things, happened in the middle of the Second World War, but this is an important moment, isn't it, in terms of what's happening in Ukraine?
It is an important moment, but as I said earlier, Parliament is absolutely pulling in the right direction. And what this speaks to is something that I think a really important principle at stake, which is that the people who lead this country have decency and integrity. And when they ask people to do incredibly difficult things, they themselves understand it fully, or they follow the rules. And I thought Theresa May's question to him in the House at the time hit the nail on the head. Either he didn't understand the rules he was applying to people, or he did, and he chose to broke them. Which was it? And he's never given us an answer to that. The Sue Gray report, the hopefully completely unredacted Sue Gray report, is eventually going to give us this answer.
Well, Boris Johnson has said he would actually publish it.
I hope so, and I hope every single other Cabinet Minister and any other MP who was involved in it is also named. I think it's different for the staff, but certainly for the elected politicians, they should be named, because then it should be up to the country to be able to hold them to account. And there are honest, good people out there, many of who voted for him at the last election, who I've spoken to in Cheshire and in North Shropshire and places like that, who are seeing what he is, they don't like it, and they're looking for what they're going to do at the next election. I think the Conservatives need to be really worried about those people.
Well, other pressures, of course, are around cost of living. That's following the spring statement or mini-budget from the Chancellor Rishi Sunak last week. Let's just show you this headline in the Financial Times. Britons face historic shock to their incomes. That's the Bank of England governor warning about that. We can show it to you here in this graph, the change in household disposable income per person. You can see it drops right down to minus 2.2%. And that's the largest fall in a single year since records began in the 1950s. Claire, does Rishi Sunak get it?
Absolutely, he gets it. I mean, this has been something which has been keeping us all up at night, and I think 8% inflation is incredibly serious for the country. We do know people are going to face a squeeze, but that's why you saw...
more than a squeeze, I think, for many.
It's going to be very, very difficult. Like, I make no bones about that. And what you saw was action being taken in autumn last year to start to address this. So, I mean, there's numbers of things that we've done. I won't reel them off, but we did an energy package in February. We obviously made changes to things like the universal credit tax rate last autumn and increased the minimum wage. And in the spring statement, you saw more measures to try and support people through this moment.
But then you cut it again. So that £20 a week is now gone. And those families are the very same ones who are being affected the worst by this. So why wasn't that not restored?
That's a different measure that you're talking about, which was a temporary uplift, which was in line with lots of things that we did temporarily through the pandemic, which obviously aren't completely sustainable. But what we did do in autumn, which you'll know, is we did a tax cut for people on universal credit worth £2 billion to 2 million people, alongside a range of other changes.
But they still have to choose between heating and eating. And I think this is the point that all the opposition parties, and actually many on your own bench, trenches are really disquietant about, because we are hearing from constituents who are literally choosing, do I feed myself or do I feed my children? And they were looking to the Chancellor in this budget to deliver a budget that was going to help them. And they still have to make those choices. And I'm sorry, you know, the fuel duty cut and things like that actually doesn't help those people. Many of them don't drive anyway. I don't think he's done enough. And I think actually this whole thing has taken the sheen off Rishi Sunak, which politically
we'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of difficult choices, which choices would you make? Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, was questioned by the Treasury Committee, and he said if you want to increase the amount of money at his disposal to help people out in the way that you've just outlined, which would you go for? Higher debt, higher tax or spending cuts?
So I think the plan that we came up with is, first of all, I do think we need to tax oil and gas, the super profits of oil and gas. That would have generated $5 billion,
but
which would have helped to wealth.
That's the most generous prediction.
As you saw from that graph, actually, the next 12 months are incredibly important. And I do wonder if he's looking ahead to headroom that he knows he's about to have in 2 years' time for an income tax hike. He could have brought that forward and actually helped the poorest now.
All right, well, that's the windfall tax. That's one one-off tax.
The second is a VAT cut. So we would cut VAT from 20% to 17.5%. And that would stimulate the economy because it bears down on inflation.
And how would it be paid for?
Well, it would need some borrowing in the short term.
OK.
But you have to... No, because productivity, and we're upfront about it, but productivity is the issue here. And if you've got high inflation, that dampens down productivity. A VAT cut would also help business. There was nothing in this budget for business at all from the party of so-called business. They've
actually, that's not true.
Completely.
We changed the employment allowance, which helps people with their NICS payment. But just to come back to this
VAT
point,
that you've raised.
Can I just come back to this VAT payment? Because I think that's a policy which, frankly, doesn't work. Because what you're saying is that people will get a cut on the VAT on their discretionary spending. And in your previous comments, you were saying that people were choosing between heating and eating. So unless they're eating in restaurants, I don't see how you're affecting the people that you're talking about. And frankly, more borrowing at a moment when interest rates is going up, I think is really irresponsible. We know that next year we're going to spend £80 billion on servicing our debt. That's 4 times what we spent last year. It's almost twice the education budget. And I think we should seriously be worried about that.
I'll come back to you both in just a moment. Do you think, Julia, that Rishi Sunak will have to come back quite soon?
Absolutely, undoubtedly. And he said yesterday at the Treasury Select Committee that if it was necessary, he would provide more help. Yes, it's obviously necessary. And it's not just the poorest families. And there are millions of those who haven't got a penny in savings, who are scrabbling around. And they're the people who often would have been hit from furlough, where, you know, a 20% cut in your wages. Well, they don't have the room for a 20% cut. They've been hit very hard. But also, you've got your average middle-income families who just don't have a spare couple of grand here. And, you know, just for the here or there, just to pay their extra heating bill. There is undoubtedly far more that needs to be done. Now, the question is, are we as a nation going to be honest with ourselves about the true cost of what needs to be done to help people? And that's a big debate, because we constantly say we want more services, but we constantly say we want to have tax cuts. Well, at some point we have to have a grown-up conversation as well.
Well, is that grown-up conversation? Do you agree with Layla, then, on higher borrowing?
I think, given the fact that interest rates are rising, I think it's probably insane to do that at this point. Other than the huge costs of lockdown, not attempting to pay them off in the short term, treating them as like a war debt. Because if we're saying this is a once in a lifetime experience, we should perhaps be rolling that debt on for many years and not trying to deal with it. But that said, I do find any politician who's saying, "Oh, isn't it terrible? We're in terrible, terrible economic times right now." If you voted for lockdowns again and again and again, you are responsible for that.
Well, I'm afraid that's not what the economic forecasts of countries that did bear down on the virus earlier show. And they have had much better growth over the last 2 years. So I think there is a conversation to be had about that. And I think this is why the inquiry being set up and reporting before the next election is so important, Julia, because actually there are conversations to be had about this. But we need some answers before people then go to the next election and make up their mind about who to vote for. I think I disagree with you on that point, but there's a lot about how the pandemic was managed and how the government managed this pandemic that people need answers for before the next election.
Right. I mean, if Julia is saying more borrowing would be insane, I think you said, and Rishi Sunak said it would be irresponsible, how do you counter that in terms of the levels of debt?
We have to look at what people are dealing with right now. Yeah. You know, I think it is the right thing to do to protect those people who are making those incredibly difficult decisions. And it's worth saying that if you look at the economy as a whole, in the medium term as well, if you're doing something that is in itself going to stimulate the economy, you actually then generate the growth that then claws it back. And I completely agree with the idea that we treat the debt from coronavirus as a war debt. But also, I think we should be going after the fraud. that they've absolutely written off, and that's not something the Treasury is doing. There are ways to claw some of this money back, and it should be being put towards the most vulnerable.
There is a short-term, obviously, well, short to medium-term, major concern over how people are going to pay and deal with their personal finances, as bills soar and inflation, as Claire said, is averaging at sort of 7.5% to the end of the year. What are the choices for Rishi Sunak?
Well, it is really difficult, not least because the thing we should remember is that historically, once inflation has risen over 5%, the only way we've been able to bring it back down again is to have a recession. Which has tended to be quite a painful experience for other reasons. Now, of course, the criticism I think you could fairly make of this budget is that he chose to protect middle earners with the fuel duty freeze rather than people right at the bottom of the income distribution by doing anything on universal credit. That, of course, is an electoral decision because broadly the Conservative coalition is, heavy on drivers and fairly low on UC claimants.
What about the politics? Leila says the shine has come off Rishi Sunak. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's that old joke about chancellors, those who fail and those who get out in time. And I think we are starting to see that Rishi Sunak may be one of the chancellors who fails rather than ones who gets out in time.
Claire?
No, I mean, look, I think he's obviously in very difficult circumstances, as all finance ministers around the world are at the moment, because these are really, really difficult times. The choices ahead are not easy, but I think he's done a really good job of trying to find that balance between helping people through this moment, but also having sustainable borrowing levels.
But what about the political question around that tax cut in 2024? That was purely political, wasn't it?
No, not at all. I think it was really important to put forward a sense of direction about what's going to happen next, because the point that he was making is that we are recovering from a pandemic which has been unprecedented. We need to boost our public services to recover with things like the waiting lists and also, in schools and things like that. But now going forward, we want to make sure we're reducing the tax burden. I think it was really important to set that out.
All right, but let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Mirror. Exclusive. Millionaire Rishi Sunak actually owns 4 cars, if you didn't know, after claiming family drive a Golf. I think they do drive a Golf, but they also have 3 other cars. I mean, there is this implication that he's personally wealthy and therefore he doesn't understand people's concerns. Is that fair?
I'm not sure it is fair. I absolutely get the point that someone who's never had to worry about whether or not there's going to be enough food on the table or whether or not can we not put the heating on because we can't afford it, let alone people saving up for holidays, which is what most families do. He's never lived any of that. He went to a private school. He's a very rich man. He's married a very rich woman. Wouldn't we all have liked to have married well, But I think it is perfectly possible for someone from that background to understand it. What I don't like is this sort of faux pretense of understanding. But I also don't like this politics of envy that, isn't it awful he's got a top-of-the-range Range Rover? Working class voters won't like that. Rubbish. Most voters would love to have a top-of-the-range Range Rover. My husband would love to have a Range Rover. I mean, this is the thing. We've got into this ridiculous thing that it's about the personality as opposed to what are people actually doing. And the reality is an awful lot of people are sitting there saying, we don't know how we're going to get through this year and we need help. But we're in the situation where we're saying we want help from the government, but we also want to have brilliant public services and we don't want to pay any more tax. And we've got to have, as I say, a grown-up conversation about it.
I mean, aren't these sorts of things a bit trivial when it comes to talking about the Chancellor?
And the fact is, no one, I don't think, would care if the budget had actually protected those who don't have enough, And the reason why these headlines stick and the reasons why it sticks in people's throats, first of all, he's a bit of an Instagram-loving Chancellor. He does a lot to sort of cultivate this image of being one of us, and there's lots of sort of candid photos. And I like his Instagram, I'm not going to lie. I mean, it's fun.
You're watching it?
I do. It's good PR. But you can smell that he's kind of trying to be every man here, and he's just not. I think he'd be much better off just leaning into who he actually is, and at the same time doing what he can, more than what he's done, to help the poorest in society. At that point, I think that none of these headlines would stick.
Right. Well, you're smiling away there, Claire, about the issue of the Instagram account. But you know Rishi Sunak really well. You've worked with him very closely over a number of years. Is that what he's like?
Gosh, no. He talks about Peloton and all kinds of things. I don't think it's fair to say that he's trying to be something that he's not. I think he's very, very open about who he is and his love of Emily in Paris and all these other things as well. I think what I would say is you should judge him by his actions, and you can see the distributional analysis of the last couple of years. By far, the policies that he's put in place have helped the poorest 10%. By far, the people who've paid the most are the the most rich. And I think that's what you should judge him on.
I mean, in the juxtaposition of saying we'll do whatever it takes during the pandemic to we will stand by people and help them, it's difficult, isn't it, to bridge that? Because there's an expectation, Stephen, that he should do whatever it takes in a cost of living crisis too. Do you think it's less likely that he will become the next leader of the Conservative Party this week than last week?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in many ways, like these two stories are, Partygate and the one we're discussing now, are intimately linked. Why is the Prime Minister more likely to survive than he was? Because the person many saw as the best available replacement is inevitably struggling with this backdrop that all finance ministers around the world are.
Right. Do you think he could be, still will be, the next leader?
I think he's got a very difficult job on his hands, and that's what he's focused.
Well, I think that everyone can probably agree with that, Claire. Let's just show you this headline in The Independent. You also heard it in the headlines. Lib Dems set out roadmap for rejoining EU single market and want to end petty Brexit squabbles. Julia's laughing. I think that's based on a quote from you, isn't it, Layla? Explain.
And it was in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the way that Liz Truss now...
Trading arrangements, obviously, with Northern Ireland since Brexit.
Look, where this has come from, and we've always been very upfront about who we are as a party. We are a party that believes that we should be at the centre of Europe. We have a long-standing policy of eventually wanting to be part of the EU, perhaps in a generation's time. Let's put a timeline on, a long way away. But this is a policy that is looking at what businesses in my constituency up and down the country are telling me, what families are saying. You look at the OBR forecasts, you showed the graph earlier. Elsewhere in that document, it tells us that we are 15% down in terms of imports and exports, that our growth is sluggish compared to other comparable nations, and they attribute that to the fact that we haven't got a trading relationship that is giving us best value for money in this country. So what we've set out in our policy is a 4-step plan. The end of it is to apply to join the single market, but actually there's some very difficult steps that we need to take as a country and bring people with us before then. For example, having a veterinary agreement that actually allows our farmers to be able to export properly into the EU to make up for some of that deficit.
All right, but you want to, that is the policy. The motion passed is to join the single market and with it freedom of movement and following all the rules. Julia.
Well, I mean, if the Liberal Democrats want to offer that at the next election and get into power and hold a referendum and we vote for joining the EU, absolutely. I'm in favour of democratic votes and democratic accountability. Never going to happen. Look, the key thing is Brexit was not just about economics. People who voted for Brexit were told for quite a long time how terrible Brexit would be of us economically. And if we believed that, then we still voted for it anyway. For me, the benefits were going to be long-term. Clearly, they've not been short-term. It's all tied in with lockdowns as well, but also the EU being incredibly obstructive and difficult on a lot of things, and also a lot of failures from this government, no doubt at all. But for me, it was about democratic accountability. I say, if you want to run for office based on that, but do remind me, how many MPs did the Lib Dems get elected at the last election?
So what I think is going to matter at the next...
The
answer's 11, and now with 13, because since then, actually, people have seen what Brexit has done. And what I found really interesting is in the Chesham and Amersham by-election, the fact that we were having sluggish growth, the fact that we couldn't get chefs for our pubs, the fact that people had seen that our farmers and our fishermen had been sold down the river, no pun intended, the fact that people had seen what this actually meant that they were looking at what had been delivered by this government. They'd found it wanting.
You don't think the fishermen were looking, people were looking at how the fishermen were treated by the French government?
Well, I think it's
and the threats to cut off...
Hang on.
I don't want to go back to where we were. We are where we are. We are where we are. And actually, we accept very much in this paper that the EU may not even ever allow us to even consider applying. But the principles in here, I think, are ones that need serious consideration. Why are we not looking to rejoin Erasmus+? I do want to make the positive case for freedom of movement because the lack of workforce that we have in social care, in hospitality, our creative industry is suffering.
Why do you think wages are going up? Because we're not importing cheap foreign labour.
These are all things... Well, the cheap foreign labour, many of whom come from Eastern Europe, we are seeing some extraordinary scenes of bravery and integrity from that part of Europe. I think we absolutely tarred them with a negative brush. I want people to start looking at freedom of movement as the positive thing that it could be. It's good for productivity. It would be good for the economy. And we set that out very clearly in the paper.
Are you persuaded, Claire?
Well, I think it's really interesting that Layla says she's responding to current events when this was their policy at the last election in 2019. So I think what is really important is we had a referendum, we had an election. Those are both resounding results, and I've not seen anything to change that.
Right, but do you agree then with your boss Rishi Sunak, who says this in the Financial Times? He admits UK's dismal recent trade might be linked to Brexit. He was an arch Brexiteer. Even he seems to be admitting that some of the poor economic results, as he put it, could be down to Brexit.
Well, he says there's a lot of uncertainty about it, but in the near term, yes. But I don't think anyone voted for near-term changes to the economy as people have been setting out. What they were looking for is a long-term position where we could link ourselves with areas of growth around the world, which is exactly what we're doing.
So what then proportion of trade have we made up with the new trade deals compared to what we had with the European Union?
My point is that just saying is you have the near term and the medium term, but we are on a path to accession to CPTPP, which is the fastest growing region in the world, which people said we wouldn't be able to do, which is 13% of global GDP.
Right, you say it's near term, but actually the Office for Budget Responsibility has said in its latest report, Claire, that its assumptions about Brexit haven't changed. It will lead to a 15% drop in trade, and that after 15 years, productivity will be 4% lower than it otherwise would have been if we'd stayed in the EU. So that's near term, medium term and pretty long term.
Well, I think if you want to talk about really near term, then obviously the benefits of having our own vaccine policy is something that we can all...
I'm sorry, I have to... We know that this is just a complete red herring. This is a complete red herring.
We could have done it, but we wouldn't have done it in the same way that France and Germany could have done it.
Well, I'm glad you admit we could have done it, because we could have done it.
So could France and Germany, but they didn't, and thousands of people died.
Right, but on the economy, what are we talking about in the near term, Claire?
So I think in the near term, trade flows do look disrupted. It's very hard to understand exactly what that is because we have had a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think we all have to
I think on that point, that's true. We have the two crises coming together. One is, like, in a way, we can blame the pandemic for so much, and it has given a shield. But we do have to look at this sort of underlying systemic issue in our economy, which the OBR does link to our trading relationship with the EU. We're not looking backwards, look forwards. How do we make it easier for businesses? How do we increase people's ability to be creative, to get the right workers in, high-skilled? This, to me, is linked to freedom of movement, and we need to have that mobility.
You're saying we don't have enough good British people to do that, so we need to import cheap labour from abroad.
That's what you're saying. We should pay them properly.
Well, we don't, because when there's a greater supply, then the wages go down.
Right, Julia said it wasn't just about the economy, and that is true, the referendum. But Claire, are you saying that we will be eventually better off with Brexit?
I mean, I absolutely think we will be. I do think we will be.
Based on what evidence?
So we are an innovation and services economy. The EU is shaped very differently from us. We're very unusual. We have the best universities.
So why does the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, not agree with you on that?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure why they don't agree with me on that, but I personally think that to be the case. And I think if you look at the ability to set our own regulation, and if you look at our ability to strike deals with countries which are similar to us, where we can, for example, share services across borders, then I think that will be a really good thing.
Right. Stephen?
Well, I think the problem is right, one, not just any economist, anyone who's tried to buy a 17-year-old on Football Manager knows that if you have barriers to trade, you have lower trade, and you therefore have lower economic growth. And it is true to say that the strengths of our economy are in services where the single market is not complete. However, of course, one opportunity cost of Brexit is that the single market will never complete in services because we are no longer in the EU. And it is unclear to me how this government can balance seeking more growth in services with its incredibly restrictive and sort of top-down central planning approach to immigration, skills, how universities operate. Right? At the same time as saying, well, we have these great universities, we also have a skills policy which is going to be very difficult for small anchor institutions. So, yeah, the problem is not just the vote in 2016, it's the political choices about the shape of Brexit to pursue, the shape of the Conservative electoral coalition, all of which do put us on this, low to stagnant growth trajectory, and it's not clear how we can get out of it.
But Brexit could have been over and done with a long time ago. I mean, this is the 5th anniversary today of the triggering of Article 50. We could have got this all over and done with much better if Theresa May hadn't tried to sell people down the river, and we hadn't had people like Layla fighting against democratic referendum result all those years.
Doing the things my constituents elected me for.
I mean, in a way, though, is the policy reopening some of the petty squabbles that you have mentioned rather than ending them?
I don't think the right thing to do in a democracy is when a conversation gets difficult is to just never talk about it again. And I think the way that we've approached this in the sort of steady, slow, we've not set a timeline. I'm not even going to commit the party to this policy at the next general election. It is a longer-term ambition that expresses, I think, some of the issues we're seeing with the economy, the direction of travel that we clearly want to take the country, but we can't do it without people's consent. And everything you say about, we have to, you're not where we want, we're not, perhaps never going to agree, but I take it as a challenge, Julia. I want to convince you next
I'm
year
also a democratic
and the year
debate.
after, slowly, that this is
all
the
you
right
have to
approach.
do is accept and respect the results of any referendum that does happen. That's all I ask.
All right, just before I get to some of the politics with Stephen, do you think there could be any economic benefits to Brexit? I mean, Julia mentions higher wages. I mean, can you be persuaded in any way of some of the economic benefits? All right, the Office for Budget Responsibility don't see it in a macro way just at the moment, but could higher wages be a good thing if they come as a result of it?
I've really tried. And I'm not one of these politicians that, and I hope I've not ever been this, is someone who just says the line. I've never been that person. It gets me into trouble occasionally. I want to hear the other side. And if I can be convinced, I will rebel. But the only thing that I've seen so far on this that is a positive is that we get duty-free when we go on holiday now. I've not seen anything.
Well, come on, Claire.
In terms of my bottom line.
You don't think higher wages is a good thing? You think that
in some sectors it wouldn't be necessarily.
In a lot of sectors.
Well, yeah. I mean, we don't quite know yet, and we don't know whether it'll be down to...
But, Julia, there comes a point where those higher wages reflect the fact that we don't have enough people who can do those jobs. And actually, for those people in the short term, that is a good thing. But then when that leads to that particular business, for example, not being able to open 2 days a week, as is the case with many pubs in my local area, the overall picture for that industry is not good.
You were happy for pubs to be shut for many months on end, Leila.
That's
I don't think you've got a leg to stand
argument,
on that.
And that's a completely
Well, I know, and I said about the politics, it's all about politics, of course, but the politics specifically about this motion that's been passed in the direction of travel by the Liberal Democrats and working with Labour, because we've heard quite a bit over the last few weeks about relationship at a general election. How would it work when they're taking this position, the Liberal Democrats, on the single market? Because Labour aren't signed up to that.
Right, it is more difficult for the Labour Party, right? If you're a Liberal Democrat, right, in terms of the types of voters you're targeting, predominantly affluent Conservative voters who weren't that happy about Brexit anyway, rejoining the single market is a policy that really sits up and works. If you're the Labour Party and you're desperate for the next election not to be one in which the word immigration can be used to attack you in any way, shape or form, this is a lot gnarlier. And you have this problem where if you do have covert or overt cooperation between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, and you're a Labour politician, you are likely to have questions like, oh, so does this mean in the event of a hung parliament, Labour might take us back to the single market in the back door? This is already a problem for Labour, though, because obviously they've gone very heavily on this idea that the Tories have no plan for growth. What is the most obvious lever you would pull if you wanted growth to go back up again? It's to rejoin the single market, and then you're once again having this, for them, very painful conversation about the free movement of people.
Claire, you've got an opportunity to persuade Leila of the benefits of Brexit.
Yes, so I personally, like I said before, I think regulation is really, really important, particularly if you're an innovation economy. And as you know, we've got a concrete example of that in the vaccines. How much quicker were we able to roll that out because we used our own regulator? And if you imagine and transfer that across all of the different things that we are developing in this country, I think it will be a really good thing.
It's not because we used our own regulator. There were other reasons, but we could have done it anyway. And if that's the only thing that you can come up with, then I'm sorry, that's not actually going to help the bottom line of people right now, is it?
I think regulation, and like I said, more trade with faster growing regions. Even the EU will say that 90% of growth coming in the global economy is outside of Europe. I think it's really good that we can open that up.
I don't see what's the problem. Surely free trade is good.
Because when you're part of the EU, you can't strike your own trade deals. That's exactly the point.
You strike bigger and better trade deals is what it always was.
But
that's the thing.
The ones that aren't suited to your...
All right, well, let's end this particular... It may not be petty, but let's end this squabble on Brexit. I know, gosh, happy memories or not, as the case may be. We're going to end by talking about COVID. Let me just show you this headline in the Herald. COVID, Scotland, face mask rules may remain, Humza Yousaf suggests. He's the health minister in the Scottish government there. The Scottish Cabinet has actually met this morning. We don't quite know what the result or the outcome is. We may not know until tomorrow. Leila, who's right? England and Wales, which have all but scrapped their COVID rules, or Scotland still considering whether to extend mask wearing? I've always been someone who believed that what you needed from the top of government was really clear messaging about what needs to happen with COVID. And the fact is we've got really, really high cases. I think their guidance from government is right. And what Tim Spector from the Zoe app says is right.
we should be wearing masks, particularly to help the most vulnerable, who are really scared right now. He says, I was just outside.
Legal rules?
And then, well, so there's a question about legal rules, but I think that what the government needs to do now is give really clear messaging. If they are saying that if you have COVID, you need to stay at home, then they really shouldn't be stopping free testing. That makes no sense whatsoever, because people need the lateral flow test to know if they've got COVID, to be able to stay at home and follow the government guidance. I think there is, and you know, if you don't want to wear a mask, fine, but I think most people should. I'm wearing it around the estate. I'm one of the few people who's still wearing it on the benches in Parliament. I genuinely think that's the right thing to do. And the reason for that is because we have huge numbers of people also suffering from long COVID. That's only going to get worse. That's a huge issue for the workforce. We've got a debate on it in Parliament on Thursday, and I think it's a looming crisis that the government's not looking at.
I mean, Julia, 215,000 cases, 217 deaths yesterday. There is always this lag
after the
weekend.
40 or 50% of those cases aren't even real cases.
But the hospitalisations, I think, rather than the deaths. But the 215,000, I mean, that is very, very high. Do you think there is still a justification for... No,
there hasn't been a justification for masks at any point, and it's mask theatre. Layla, I was chatting with you just outside the studio and you weren't wearing a mask at all and we weren't on television. It's a load of nonsense. It's theatre. If people are genuinely concerned, they can wear N95 or above proper medical-grade masks. If you are simply wearing a piece of cloth or a bit of blue paper...
so you would be happy then to advocate...
I'm not happy. No. If you're not at high risk, I'm sorry, once you've been vaccinated, I find the strangest thing, the people who are most obsessed with this seem to be the people who don't trust the vaccine. I've been vaccinated. I've had COVID twice. A mask will make no difference whatsoever. It's an absolute load of
I think you've misunderstood how the vaccine works. So what happens is
really
that... OK, so when we've had lots of evidence taken on this in the all-party group on coronavirus, you see the graphs, you have the vaccine. Initially, your antibodies are high, and then after about 2 months, 3 months, they start to wane. So
I've had COVID twice, thank you. So
and you either have it right. So many people will have last had their vaccine just before Christmas. We're now at the point where it's beginning to wane, particularly for the most vulnerable. It's right that they're getting vaccinated, but meanwhile, while that uptake is happening, the rest of us can do our part. Wear our masks.
The masks don't make any difference. It's theatre. There's no evidence for it.
It's an airborne disease. Of course, it makes a difference.
Why aren't you wearing one now?
Right, can we relax about COVID, though, Claire? In the way that the government has got rid of all the restrictions, certainly the legal ones, implies that we can.
Well, look, I think it's really important that we do. I think it's really important that we get back to a sense of normality. Yes, the cases are rising. I think we're all looking at that. And, of course, we should keep everything in review and make sure that we are doing the right things. But the truth is they're not translating into the levels of hospitalisations that we were seeing before because the vaccine is working. And we've got a new programme of spring boosters for people who are over 75 coming. I would urge anyone who can take them to go and take their vaccine. But clearly we're in a very different position than we were, say, a year ago.
What about the balance between government issuing guidance and perhaps legal rules and individual responsibility?
Well, I think once you have a vaccine, I think it becomes inappropriate for government to compel things like stay-at-home orders, mask wearing, and it becomes the government's responsibility to make sure that the healthcare system is adequately prepared to deal with a new disease in the system. Personal responsibility, of course, is very different, right? There is no law that compels me not to smoke in the home of a friend who doesn't smoke. I don't do it because it's, polite and common. Yeah, it's polite and decent. And I think in many ways we are moving to a stage where most COVID rules should be about the government providing guidance as it does with, how much fruit and veg you should eat, what is a safe and responsible way to be a responsible citizen, rather than compulsion from the top.
Which is almost impossible to do if you don't have LFTs. And the one thing I would urge, lateral flow test, and one thing I would urge the government to do is to not, it's next week that we can no longer get hold of them. In fact, many people are trying to get hold of them this week because they've got COVID or know someone who does, and then unable to.
Do you need a test to know if you've got a flu? Because I wouldn't visit an elderly relative if I had flu or indeed a bad cold.
But also you just have to look at what's happening across the hospitals. I'm getting SOS calls from people on the front line who are overwhelmed. We've got a tenth of teachers are off, and so you've got people who aren't getting the education they deserve because you've got...
It didn't bother you when you voted to close schools for months on end.
No, they never closed, Julia. The teachers went in, and that's why teachers, along with social care workers, have the highest prevalence of long COVID, followed by healthcare workers. Teachers went in.
It's amazing how people in the public sector have long COVID, isn't it?
Do you think it is right to actually start charging for lateral flow tests at this stage?
Well, I think you've got to look about where we are at the moment. So we've got £24 billion a year in terms of the testing programme that's been in place, and it's right that we change that so we can focus on the cost of living.
All right, well, thank you for that. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. And, of course, I will be back tomorrow with the PMQ's Even programme at 11:15. Bye-bye.